me to love with open arms just like you do. It doesn't get any better than that, does it? Well, today and this month, we're going to be talking about daring meals with Jesus. That's our theme for the month, our teaching theme. If you've ever traveled outside our country, it's always a culinary adventure, isn't it? You go into any other country and the food is always so great and unique. When Veronica and I first got married, we were able to honeymoon in Paris. And our first night in Paris, we went out to eat and we started to order in our broken college French from Biola. And finally, the waiter's shaking his head, and his English was better than our French. He said, I need to order for you. And so we said, go ahead. So he ordered me a roasted pork with like some kind of sauteed apples on top and a cream sauce. And then Veronica still talks about the steak béarnaise that he ordered for her. She says she's never before or since had steak béarnaise like this. And then for dessert, he brings these cream puffs with like chilled cream injected inside a hot whatever that thing is. And then there's warm chocolate drizzled on top. That was our first night in Paris. When I went to Cuba for the first time in Havana, we landed in Havana. I took a basketball team there, and our host took us straight to a church. And about 200 people showed up from the church, and they had emptied all the chairs out, and instead they put dinner tables in. Because the first thing they wanted us to do in Cuba was to have a Cuban meal with them. And when you get to Havana, one of the first things you notice, and around this dinner table, is that everyone, it seems like, is from a different continent on earth. It felt like heaven sitting there in that church in Havana having a meal our first day. And then we went to Santiago de Cuba, and our host, Tomas Herrera, the president of the Cuban Basketball Federation, the first thing he did was take us to his mother's house. That's what you do in Cuba, and eat at his mother's house. Then we had a pig roast. I was in India a few months ago, and it was my first time there, and we'd gotten there late, way past dinner time, like 1 a.m. So when I woke up, I was hungry. And so I went down to the breakfast restaurant, and I started to look at what was offered for breakfast, and it looked like curry and lentil curry and a lot of curry. And there was a guy there, and he looked like an engineer. So I said, hey, do you speak English? He said, yeah. He said, I'm from Houston. I'm Indian, but I live in Houston. I said, so you guys eat curry for breakfast? He says, oh yeah, you want to eat, because I see some scrambled eggs over here, and I asked him about the eggs. He said, every Hampton Inn has scrambled eggs. You need to have some Indian curry. So I had Indian curry for breakfast, and it was amazing. And then the rest of my group came down, and they're like, you're eating curry for breakfast? And I said, yes, I am. And everywhere we went, I tried a different there's more kinds of curry than you can name in India. We had it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. My one mistake, though, was in Hyderabad. At lunch at a school, they served us fish curry. Well, Hyderabad is about 1,000 miles from the beach, all right? It's a long way. It's like ordering lobster in Phoenix. Maine's a long way. At 2 a.m, you're reminded that you're a long way from the ocean. That's the only mistake there. Well, we're talking about meals because Jesus, it seemed like, was always on his way to a meal, having dinner, leaving dinner, or telling a story about food. Jesus, I'll go out on a limb today and say Jesus was a foodie. I think so. And I think that might be a fact because, for example, in Luke chapter 7, we read this about Jesus. The Son of Man, Luke says, came eating and drinking. Luke doesn't say the Son of Man came in a blaze of glory. The Son of Man, he doesn't say he came with an army of angels. The Son of Man came eating and drinking. And when Luke writes about Jesus's eating habits, it wasn't just subsistence eating. We read, in fact, that it sounds like Jesus ate quite a lot, because his food critics would say he's a glutton. He overeats. Some of you maybe have thought, hey, I shouldn't have eaten the double animal style. I ate the whole thing. I want to say, go ahead and do it because Jesus might have done that as well. Even in Luke chapter 5 earlier, his food critics come to him and they said this. They said, the disciples of John, they fast and they pray. In other words, they don't eat. And the disciples of the Pharisees, they fast and they eat. But they said, Jesus, your disciples, they eat so much. That's what they said to him. And so we have all of these stories and instances around food. In fact, Luke is almost like the book about food. I have a few examples here. It seems like almost every other chapter, there's something about a meal. Levi hosts a banquet for Jesus at his house with some really sketchy people. Luke 7, he eats at the Pharisee's house and a woman joins him. That was unheard of. Luke 9, he feeds 5,000, and my guess is there were leftovers. I think Jesus ate too. Luke 10, he eats with Martha and Mary, and they get into an argument and all kinds of things like that over food. Luke 11, the Pharisees, his food critics, invite him to eat with them. Luke 14, over a dinner, he tells a story about food, and he says, these are the kinds of people you should have for dinner. Luke 15, he shares a story about a father who throws a feast for a runaway son. Luke chapter 16, he talks about a hungry man who's begging a rich man just for his leftovers. Luke 19, Jesus invites himself to dinner with Zacchaeus. Luke 22, we call it his Last Supper, but it's not his Last Supper because he dies, but then he comes back to life 3 days later and he's hungry. So on this road to Emmaus, he says to the two guys with him, two people with him, he says, we got to stop and eat. We need some food here. I think it was like a Love's roller dog or something along like that. One of those hot dogs on the rollers. I don't know, but he stops and they eat on the road to Emmaus. Like I said, it seemed like Jesus was always talking about food on his way to a meal, having a dinner, leaving a dinner. Why did he talk so much about food? Because meals are more than food, aren't they? A dinner is more than the food that we eat. For us as Christians, I think the meal embodies our mission. A meal is really a living representation that Christ is among us. For Jesus, sharing a meal was not just a metaphor. He was actually not just a metaphor of bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth, but in the meal, he was actually bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth. There's this key idea that I hope you take home this thought with you today, that meals for Jesus are always representing something bigger. They point to a new kind of world, a new kingdom, a new outlook, a new way to live. That's how it was with the meals that Jesus ate. And meals, like I said, for Jesus were both symbols and application. They are not just pictures of the kingdom of heaven coming to earth. They're the kingdom of heaven coming to earth in miniature over a table. I said a minute ago that food is more than something that just fills our stomach. I know that's a fact because of Teddy. I don't know if you heard about Teddy in Tucson. Teddy is 5 years old, and last week it was his birthday in Tucson. And so his mother took birthday invitations to his kindergarten class, and she gave one to 32 kids in his class. And it was to Chuck E. Cheese, and they're gonna have pizza and play there. And so Teddy and his mom showed up at Chuck E. Cheese, and she set 32 places for all the kids from his class. And then she ordered piles of pizza. And then she called Teddy out of the ball pit, and he came over, but none of his friends had come. This is Teddy. And the table is set. By the way, give him some props. He's wearing his pajamas to his birthday party, and that's just extra right there. But he's there, and none of his friends are there. And his mother said, Teddy would hardly eat. He just wanted his friends there. Do you see, it doesn't matter how much pizza you gave Teddy. The meal only works if your friends are there to sit with you. That's why I say the meal is more than food. By the way, side note, the Phoenix Suns found out about this, the tragedy of no friends at your birthday party. So they invited Teddy up to a Suns game on Friday. They said, come celebrate your birthday with us. We'll show up. And so he got to hang out on the sideline with them the whole basketball game. So that was Teddy's birthday. I said the meal is more than food. When I say that, I think about Nigel Slater. Nigel is a famous British food critic and food aficionado. And he writes widely on food in England. And in Nigel Slater's memoir, he writes about how when he was just a little kid, when his mother kissed him goodnight one night, he said, "Mommy's kisses feel like marshmallows." I think most mothers' kisses feel like that. But then when he was 9 years old, his mother suddenly died. But his father remembered what Nigel had said when he was younger. And so every night after his mother died, his father would sneak in his room before bedtime and leave a marshmallow on the pillow. Do you see why I say food is more than something that fills our stomach? A meal with others, it's really saying something. A meal with others is like an embrace. A meal that you've invited people to is a warm welcome. A meal is a statement of acceptance. It's a statement of solidarity. And best of all, it's a meal with others. As Christians, for us, it becomes a living manifestation of Jesus Christ in our midst. Open your Bibles to Luke chapter 14. And of all the chapters in the Bible, I'm going to name this one the food chapter, because the whole chapter 14 is about food. We read this. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat at the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. Then Jesus said to his host, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends or brothers or sisters, your relatives or your neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you'll be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. And then over dinner, he tells this story. A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. But they all alike began to make excuses. Then the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servant, go out quickly to the streets and alleys and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, the lame. Sir, the servant said, verse 22, we have done that. But there's still room. The master said, go out to the roads, the country lanes, and compel them to come in, so my house will be full. So here, Jesus is challenging us to open our homes to the least and to the last, to the others from the other part of town or from the other place, to open our homes like that. There's a word for this, and it's called hospitality. It's an English word, but I don't think we use in our vernacular, we don't use the word hospitality so much anymore. I think the first and only sermon I've ever heard on hospitality was back in April when we invited Tim Blackman, a friend of mine who's the chaplain at Wheaton College, to come and preach. And the title of his sermon was Dangerous Hospitality. And if you were here, you remembered he talked about his grandfather was an African-American from South Carolina, but he married a woman from Holland. So his mother was Dutch. And his grandparents during World War II started to hide Jews in the basement of their church. And they lived in the church on the main level. But underneath them, they were hiding the Jews. And then the Germans took their town. And the German officers came to to his grandfather, who was the pastor of the church, and said, we want to use your upstairs, the second story, as our officer quarters. Well, of course, he said, okay, you can use it. So the Germans are on the second floor, and his grandparents lived on the main floor and where the kitchen was. And his grandmother was cooking meals for the German officers, and at the same time cooking food for the Jews they're hiding in the basement. And if anybody found out each other was there, they're all gonna die, okay? That's dangerous hospitality. After Tim Blackman was here, Paul and Gunther and I talked, and I said, this needs to be our theme for November. Let's talk about the daring meals that Jesus ate. And so we're talking about meals and what they represent. We're talking about this idea of hospitality this month. I think for us as Christians today, the idea of hospitality, I think it's lost its moral bearing. We see hospitality as Christians, we see it as a nice idea. If I ask you, what do you know about hospitality? You might talk about the hospitality industry, like Airbnb or VRBO. You might say something like that. But none of us talk about really practicing hospitality. Many churches have hospitality committees because they believe even Christians are too busy to actually practice it. But most of us, even Christians, don't see hospitality as a spiritual imperative. But Jesus, when he talks about inviting strangers in, he connects it to our spiritual condition. And he says, if you are a follower of mine, then you will practice hospitality. For the ancient Jew, hospitality was a pillar of society. They knew that the moral backbone of their culture rested on this idea of welcoming the stranger. In the Bible, when it talks about hospitality, especially in the Old Testament, the term sojourner is used. It comes from the Hebrew word ger, and it's used 92 times in the Old Testament, we're told, to show hospitality to the sojourner or the stranger. What does that word mean? The word ger or sojourner, it means someone who is traveling through, someone from another place who speaks another language, someone who is an immigrant or a temporary resident. That's a sojourner. And the host, the Jewish host, knew that they were expected to show the sojourner a warm welcome, to give them food, lodging, protect them, keep them safe. Why was this the part of the moral grounding for Hebrew society? Why was that? It was because every Jew knew that they had been sojourners in a foreign country where they were abused and oppressed by the Egyptians and the Babylonians. And so when God released them in this covenant with Moses, part of the covenant is you will show hospitality to the sojourner, to the stranger when they come into your town, into your home. And so this idea of welcoming the stranger, it echoes through the Bible kind of like a mantra. It just goes on and on. I want to share, I said 92 times in the Bible it mentions our call to show hospitality to the sojourner. I want to read you a few, not 92. I'm just going to read you 4. And we read this. This is Deuteronomy 10. God loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing, and you are to love those who are foreigners. For you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. Every Jew knew they had been a sojourner as well. Deuteronomy 26. Share a tithe or a tenth of your first fruits with the immigrants, the orphans, and the widows, so they can eat in your cities until they're full. Leviticus, treat the foreigner the same as a native born. Love them like one of your own. Remember that you were once foreigners in Egypt. Psalms, the Lord watches over the foreigner. And Jesus in Matthew 25 says, I was a stranger and you invited me in. I share all of that to say to us as a church that at the Grove, we hope we can rediscover and start to practice again this spiritual, biblical imperative of showing hospitality to the sojourner. It's for this reason that we have these big dining room tables around the room, because you've heard me say that, in my opinion, Jesus' favorite metaphor for the kingdom of heaven coming to earth is a dinner and a table where everyone of every background, nationality, ethnicity, race is welcome to sit at his table. Hospitality in the New Testament was central to the meaning of the idea of gospel. And I don't know if you've ever thought about hospitality and being gospel and gospel coming together, but they do. Because if you think about it like this, the gospel of Jesus Christ, we would all agree, is welcomed everywhere. In every place where the gospel is heard or announced or preached, it's for everyone. And so if the gospel is for everyone, then so shouldn't our homes be open to everyone, and so shouldn't our lives be open to everyone, and so shouldn't our dining room tables be open to everyone. For the New Testament Christians, as they started to eat together, by the way, after every worship service, they would have a meal, the churches that Paul planted. They would sit down, the wealthy sitting next to the slaves, the wealthy sitting next to the Jew, sitting next to the foreigner, and sometimes the foreign slave. But this practice of having meals with people who were socially separate from you, for the first and for the early Christians, was the surest, most certain proof that you were a follower of Jesus Christ, if you could do that, because no one had ever seen or heard of a meal like that before. Hospitality, as I challenge us to it this morning, is something, I think it's both an art and a skill. I think it's something that you're going to have to practice in order to get good at. Malcolm Gladwell says that will take 10,000 hours. That's a lot of cooking, but that's what it's going to take. If there's a thought that you take home with you this morning, I invite you to take this thought with you. That hospitality is an attitude of warm welcome and a posture of embrace. It's those two things. It's a warm welcome. It's an attitude, and then it's a posture of embrace. I want to start with this first part of the phrase. Hospitality is a warm welcome. Have you ever traveled somewhere and received a cold welcome? Has that ever happened to you? It's happened to me, and you never forget it. I remember a number of years ago traveling to Abidjan in West Africa, Cote d'Ivoire, and I had a friend, Dave Holmquist, the AD, and he was a basketball coach at Biola at the time, and he traveled with me, and we were going there to visit Liberians who had fled the Civil War and were living in Ivory Coast as refugees. And so I had packed 5 suitcases, big suitcases full of shoes, clothes, cleats, high tops, neckties, everything things I could give away. Well, on our way there, we stopped in New York, then we stopped in Dakar, Senegal, and our plane broke down. We're down for 7 hours. Finally, we get to Abidjan, but now it's like 1:30, pushing 2 o'clock in the morning. But 2 of my Liberian friends were there. They were refugees, but they stayed up and met us at the airport. We got a taxi, and we go to this guest house. And my father had told me, hey, the guy who runs the guest house, he's a missionary. He's a good friend of mine. He's going to be so happy to see you. Just make sure you say you're the son of Jack Chinchen, and I've let him know you're coming. So at about 2:30 in the morning, we show up at this missionary guest house. And my 2 Liberian friends, they leave with a taxi, and me and Coach are left with 5 big suitcases. So I go up to the guest house, and I see an intercom. I've never seen an intercom that worked in Africa, but I hit the button anyway, and it worked. And it makes a sound, buzzes, no one answers. I hit it again, it buzzes. Finally, like the 3rd time, someone very groggy at 2:30 in the morning says, who is that? And I said, hey, it's Palmer Chinchen, Jack Chinchen's son. He said, you were expecting me. He said, his next words were, is this a joke? I said, no, it's not a joke. And then he answered, he says, this is the rudest thing I've ever experienced. You're waking me up at almost 3 in the morning. I said, hey, man, I'm really sorry. Our plane got delayed in Dakar, Senegal. I said, then he says this, I'm not coming downstairs. I said, excuse me, sir, I don't have anywhere else to sleep tonight. And he says, I'm hanging up now. And that's it. The intercom goes silent. And I was like, what? And so Dave Holmquist and I, we sit on the suitcases, and I'm like thinking, the guy had an accent, all right? He wasn't Ivorian, he wasn't American, he was from another country. And I don't want to say the name of the country because you'll think I don't like the people, and that's not the case. when I think of these people, they're always saying things like, hey, good day, mate. Hey, throw another shrimp on the Barbie, I'm thinking, but no, I got the only one rude Australian in the world. That's who's upstairs. The rest are awesome. Anyway, so we're sitting on the suitcases, and Holmquist saying, what do we do now? I go, I have no idea. I'm out of options. I have no plan B. And after about 10, maybe 15 minutes, I see the downstairs door open. And here comes our grouchy friend, and he goes, all right, I'm going to give you a place to sleep, but only because this morning at church, so it's Monday, 2 in the morning, he says, only because this morning at church, the preacher preached on Luke chapter 11, where a stranger comes at midnight, and the man's trying to find him bread and food. So that's the only reason, because of that sermon. I said, all right, thank you very much. That's what it's like to have a cold welcome. In Luke chapter 14, we go back to our text. Jesus sees that people are scrambling in verse 7 for seats of honor at the table. And he noticed that some thought that they were better than others. And he stops the meal and he says, my tables are level. At my table, socially disparate people sit together as one. Here's what happens over a meal. I think sharing a meal, like we're going to share tomorrow night, it changes our perspective. There's a researcher and writer by the name of Alice Joyner, and she writes a book titled Eating Together. And she's done research on what happens when we sit down and share a meal, especially a meal with people who are the other, from the other part of town or from the other country or who speak another language. She said, when you sit down with people who are different with you over a meal, it changes how you view them. It changes your perspective. She says stereotypes break down and barriers come down, and you start to see the good and the beauty in them, and you start to understand how brilliant they are. She says meals have a way of doing that, and I think she's right. Meals not only break down barriers, I think having a meal with someone who is much different than you are, it changes us. It's one of the reasons we do our one table event that we started about 3 or 4 years ago. What happened is, I was telling our staff that the meals that Jesus ate, they're a lot different than our communion, okay? So I'm all for communion, I love communion, but when I take communion at the Grove afterwards, I'm still hungry, all right? It's not that filling, all right? There's just not a whole lot. We have the gluten-free bread even, and I'm all for gluten-free, but it's not filling. And I told our staff, if we really want to practice as a church what Jesus did, we need to sit down and everybody eats until you're full. And so we did our first one-table event out here. And then last year, we had 1,000 people out here for one dinner. And tonight, we're going downtown Chandler to do that. Because when you sit down together, it's just not about the food, but something changes in your perspective. In Jude, so Jude is talking about the meals that they ate after their worship services. For Paul's church plants, every one of them after their worship, they had a meal, not just wafers and Welch's. They had a true meal. And Jude called his meals in Jude 1:12. He calls them agape feast. He says they are love feast. They are feast of unconditional love. That's what you're invited to do tonight. That's how we're invited to live. I said that hospitality is an attitude of warm welcome, and I said hospitality is also a posture of embrace. It's an attitude and it's a posture. In Luke chapter 15, if you turn over one page in your Bible from where we've been, we read that Jesus tells another story. And he tells a story about a son who runs away from home. But then the son comes back home and the father sees him a long way up. He runs to the son. And in chapter 15, verse 20, we read that the father spreads his arms open wide and he embraces, and scripture uses that, embraces his son. And when after he embraces his son, he says this, all right, now we got to eat. Now we're going to go eat. And he throws a big old feast. That's what we see there. The father, when he embraces him, it changes the son. There's a body language expert by the name of Amy Cuddy. She's written a well-known book now titled The Power of Posture. And she talks about how our posture changes how we feel. For example, maybe some of you have seen her book. I'll use this mic here. For example, she says there's the superhero power pose. So if you stand like this before me, she says, go in a closet or your bathroom, stand like this and for 2 minutes before you go into an important meeting, and then people will listen to you, all right? She also says, I'll use this here. She says there's the CEO pose. She says, so if you're in a meeting and people aren't listening to you, she says, go to the CEO pose. This is it, like this, and just put your hands behind your back. Then everyone thinks you're in charge. And her point is, she says, posture changes us. The posture matters. And sometimes I think when we talk about our posture toward the other, and from people toward people from other places, of other nationalities, I think sometimes our posture is like this. It's like crossed arms, like don't get too close to me. I think sometimes our posture is like this. Or sometimes our posture is we're pointing and accusing and blaming. But what if instead the posture of our life was to open our arms? What if our posture toward the other was like that of Jesus, that we open the doors of our home and we open our hearts and we open our lives? I think that's the posture that Christ wants us to go through life with. This last week at the Grove was my proudest week that I've had of being a pastor here. Last Sunday, as Josh mentioned, we had been asked if we could provide lodging and meals for some families that were in transition. And so we put these cards all over, I think on the chairs and the bulletins, and we had said we would do it. I thought we'd be lucky to have 5 people say, I'll have a stranger in my house. And Sunday after church, there were 64 cards. And one of our staff, she took them to her office, and I said, hey, you're gonna try to enter all of those right now? And she said, yeah. I said, well, you don't work this afternoon. Why don't you give me at least half of them? So she gave me 39 of them. And I took them home with me. And I started to, because we needed to build an Excel spreadsheet to give to Customs and Immigration of who would be hosting here. And as I started to enter these, as I watched the Cardinals win, one at a time, I was able to pray and say, God, thank you for this family. Thank you. And I started to pray over all of you who filled out these cards one at a time. I've held a lot of cards in my hands as a pastor here at the Grove. I've held some of our campaign pledge cards, and pastors like those. I've held our first-time visitor cards. Sometimes in August, there's big stacks when school starts. We've had, will you volunteer around here cards. I've held those, but these have felt precious. I've kept them with me all week. I've had them on my desk in my backpack all week. Because who would think 64 families here would say, I'm opening up my home and my dinner table and my heart to strangers, to people I've never met before. And like Josh said, there was a lot of apprehension about what would it be like to have complete strangers from another land in my house. It was kind of like this. On Halloween night, we still had one of the 2 families in our home. And so we took them to my son Byron's house to go trick-or-treating. And the daughter was almost 3-year-old Natalia. She's a little tiny girl about this big. And so we started to take her around trick-or-treating. She had never been trick-or-treating in our life. But I'm gonna tell you this, even 3-year-olds learn really quick how to trick-or-treat when there's free candy. And so she caught on quickly. And so we trick-or-treated for a block, and then we came back to my son's house, and he had a fire pit, and we all sat around with some of our family and some good friends. And we hadn't been sitting long when my daughter-in-law, Christine, walked out of the house with a birthday cake and candles. So I said to her, oh, you didn't have to do that. Because we kind of have this tradition. My birthday is November 1st, the day after Halloween, every year. Every year, it's the day after Halloween. So we have this tradition that somebody shows up with a birthday cake. So I said, oh, you didn't have to do that. And she just smiled at me. And then she started to light the candles. And then after she lit the candles, she said, hey, everybody, we're going to sing happy birthday to Natalia because Natalia's birthday is November 2nd. They're not going to sing happy birthday to Palmer. This old guy doesn't need it. But a 3-year-old who hasn't had a home and hasn't had a meal in 4 days needs a birthday cake. And so we sang happy birthday to Natalia, first in English and then in Spanish to Google Translate, and we sang it twice. And as I tell you about that, who's the blessed one now? Our family is the blessed one. We're the fortunate one. We feel like we were blessed maybe more than they were by opening up our home. And that's what biblical hospitality looks like. I challenge you, I invite you as followers of Jesus Christ to start seeing everyone around you as God's sons and daughters, that you see them as your brothers and sisters. And then you start to open your homes and your life to the other. People from the other part of town, people from the other background, people from the other country who speak another language. That's our challenge this morning. That's our challenge this month.